अस्सलाम वालेकुम। प्रोग्राम एम्बेसी रोड में खुश आमदीद। नाज़रीन, आज इस प्रोग्राम में हमारे मेहमान हैं, पाकिस्तान में कौंसलर सेक्शन के हेड हैं और अफ़गानिस्तान और पाकिस्तान दोनों के लिए कौंसलर सेक्शन की निगाहदाश्त करते हैं, इसकी देखभाल करते हैं, इसके हेड हैं। आज हमारा मौजूद गुफ्तगू जो है वो है जबरी शादियाँ। हम सब जानते हैं कि बरतानिया में इस वक्त तकरीबन 12 से 15 लाख पाकिस्तानी मुकीम हैं और कई उनमें ऐसे भी शहरी हैं पाकिस्तानी जो कि गुज़श्ता 4 या 5 दहाइयों से बरतानिया में ही मुकीम है। उनकी चूँकि वो उस समाज का, उस सोसाइटी का हिस्सा बन चुके हैं और अपनी रवायात लेके वहाँ जा रहे हैं और उससे कई पेचीदगियाँ पैदा हो रही हैं, जिसमें एक बड़ी पेचीदगी जो है वो फोर्स्ड मैरिज या जबरी शादी है। इस जबरी शादी को रोकने के लिए बरतानी कवानीन जो हैं वो मुतहर्रक होते हैं, वो एक्टिवेट होते हैं और रोकने की कोशिश करते हैं कि जबरी शादी जो है इंसानी हकूक़ की एक खिलाफ वर्जी समझी जाती है सारी दुनिया में। ये हमारा मौजू है आज का और हम बात करेंगे जॉन रेन से कि वो इस बारे में क्या कर रहे हैं, जबरी शादियों का रुझान जो है क्या कम हो रहा है या बढ़ रहा है और इसके लिए क्या इक़दाम किए जा रहे हैं। Thank you very much for joining us in this program.
It's a pleasure.
The forced marriage has been a problem for a very long period of time. As we know that the Pakistani community living in UK is indulging in forced marriages. So, and the UK government has been taking very active measures as well to reverse this trend. So, have you been able to achieve some success?
We have. I'm happy to report we have. Globally, we're seeing the numbers of forced marriages decreasing. Certainly the numbers that we're hearing about as a government and the numbers that we're taking action on. And the decrease globally between 2016 and 2017 here. So we're winning the fight, I think, against forced marriage.
But the Pakistani community living in UK over the periods of time, have not they been able to learn that forced marriage is illegal and unethical and is against the fundamental human rights?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that with over 1.2 million British Pakistanis living in the UK, it's a very small number that would consider forcing their offspring into marriage. So this is not a particular problem of the Pakistani community as a whole. There are a number of things that we can do to change hearts and minds, to highlight the illegality of forced marriage, to highlight some of the social consequences, the consequences on family of forced marriage, and indeed to have scholars speak to the community about the theological issues around forced marriage and the haram nature of forced marriage, and slowly some of those messages are sinking home.
What legal steps are being taken? Is some legislation in the offing in UK to curb the trend of forced marriages?
So we passed some legislation back in 2014, which was around the Antisocial Behaviour Act, that created something called a Forced Marriage Protection Order. And this is a very, very important legal instrument for us. When we tackle forced marriages here in Pakistan, in almost every forced marriage, we can see that there are two constituencies. There's a family in the UK and there's a family in Pakistan.
Yes.
And they collaborate on perpetrating the forced marriage. Now, as British consul, obviously I have no jurisdiction here in Pakistan. What I can do, working with police colleagues and lawyers back in the UK, is take out a forced marriage protection order and I can serve it on the UK family. Now, if that forced marriage protection order is breached, if the forced marriage victim is forced into marriage, that protection order carries a 5-year prison tariff. So increasingly in fighting forced marriage, we're taking legal action through the British courts and we're having some successes.
But the older people, the generation, Pakistani generation, which went to UK back in 60s and 70s, they were certainly, they had a mindset. And with the passage of time, a new generation has been brought up there. They were educated in UK, and they're quite familiar with society and very familiar with the legal constraints as well. So despite that, this trend is persisting, continuing.
I think one thing that we do see is there's a long tradition, a long history of arranged marriage in South Asian communities. And we have no issue with that whatsoever. It's part of the tradition here, and we fully accept that. However, when one side of the arranged marriage feels pressured and there's a little bit of coercion, that's when we cross over from an arranged marriage to a forced marriage, and that's when we will intervene.
Right. Despite, in addition to the legal measures that you are taking to stop this trend or to curb this trend, what other measures you are using, or what other tools you are using to discourage forced marriages?
Well, we're doing a lot of proactive work. We're doing proactive work here in Pakistan, talking to communities. We're doing a lot of proactive work in the UK, both talking to communities, but also speaking to schools and police officers, educating teachers, for example, that they might be able to spot the signs of a forced marriage. That's what we're doing proactively. Reactively, there are a number of measures we can take to disrupt a forced marriage. If you'll forgive me, I won't go into all the measures that we can take within our playbook, but they range from just a mediated solution, dialogue with the family underlying some of the issues around forced marriage, illegality, and so on and so forth. Right through to what we would call the forced marriage rescue, which is where we will turn up at the house of a forced marriage victim with police and armoured cars and so on and so forth, and we'll physically get the forced marriage victim out and back to the UK. Increasingly, though, as we've said, we find that taking the legal route, going through the British courts, is proving the most effective.
But the religious factor is also playing its role in the forced marriages, you know, and are you using this religious tool also to convince people that this is also not ethical, not moral, not legal?
Well, I'm not qualified in any way to speak about the sort of theological arguments of forced marriage, but I have spoken to many religious scholars. We have engaged with the religious scholars, sent religious scholars back to the UK to engage with the communities, and all of them have been very clear, very resolute that forced marriage is and
right. So, any incentives which are being given to these people, the Pakistani community living in the UK, that they should move away from this trend of forced marriages?
I can't think of any specific incentives as such. And it's worth underlining, I think, that forced marriage is illegal in the UK. Of course, it's illegal here in Pakistan too. So I don't think incentives are appropriate. I think the proactive work we will do is about spotting what is a crime, what is illegal, and ensuring that that we can act in time to disrupt the marriage.
But have you noticed that this tendency of forced marriages is related to a certain set of people belonging to a certain part of Pakistan, for instance, from Mirpur, Azad Kashmir, or some specific areas where the people go for these forced marriages?
So we're certainly of the opinion that forced marriage sadly is happening all over Pakistan. The British High Commission engages solely where British large clusters in AJK, so Mirpur, as you mentioned. We have some British nationals in KP, particularly around Nowshera, and smaller numbers again down in Karachi. For us, yeah, it tends to be northern Punjab and AJK that we engage with most, because those are the highest concentrations of British nationals.
With the passage of time, I mean, in the coming days, in the years to come, you think that this trend will die down, it will subside?
That's certainly what we're working towards, and I do remain optimistic. I mean, I remain optimistic about lots of things in Pakistan, but I think forced marriage, I think in general, women's rights, we will continue to work to push that in the right direction to ensure that nobody is forced into a marriage that they're not comfortable with.
The government of Pakistan is cooperating with the UK authorities in curbing this trend, or you know, in implementing the law or the legal requirements?
We've got very good cooperation with, particularly with law enforcement agencies here in Pakistan. They keep us safe when we have to travel, and indeed we engage with them on the illegality of forced marriage. So we work hand in glove with the Pakistan authorities when we hear about a forced marriage case here.
How many Pakistanis have been penalized in UK who were indulging or who indulged in these forced marriages?
Well, you may have seen quite recently we had quite a high-profile case in Birmingham where the mother of a forced marriage victim has just been sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. In fact, that was only the second conviction for forced marriage that we've had. We had a previous conviction that resulted in a fine in South Wales. So we're awaiting, I should mention, the sentencing of another family who've been convicted in forced marriage, albeit that was connected to Bangladesh, not here to Pakistan. 2 convictions sounds like a very small number given the amount of forced marriage. Story, because the forced marriage protection orders that we can take out, the legal process that we follow is so effective in preventing the forced marriage. The orders don't get breached and the convictions don't follow.
Any preemptive measures to prevent forced marriages to take place? I mean, you can have the intelligence, you can have information that this is going to happen, or there's a likelihood that a forced marriage is going to take place. So you through a preemptive measure, you can stop it.
Certainly through the outreach we do into UK communities, schools, community centres, mosques, so on and so forth, and that's run by my colleagues back in London. Those can be very effective preventive measures. The one thing I would like to say, though, if anybody watching this is being forced into a marriage they're not happy with, or they know of anybody being forced into a marriage they're not happy with, then they should get in touch, because as a British High Commission, we can help British nationals in that situation. We can get them out of that marriage and we can get them safely back to the UK.
Right, thank you. We'll take a short break and then we'll continue this discussion. नाज़रीन, एक मुख्तसर ब्रेक लेते हैं. ब्रेक से वापसी के बाद हम पाकिस्तान में जॉन रियॉन जो कि कौंसल सेक्शन के हेड हैं उनसे गुफ्तगू करेंगे और जारी रखेंगे ये गुफ्तगू का सिलसिला. वो हमें बता रहे हैं कि बरतानिया में जबरी शादियां जो हैं उसका रुझान जो है आस्ता आस्ता उसमें कमी तो आ रही है, लेकिन अभी मुकम्मल तौर पर ख़त्म नहीं हुआ, और उसके सिलसिले में बरतानवी हुकूमत जो है वो बड़े इफ़ेक्टिव और मौसर इक़दाम उठा रही है, जिनमें कानूनी इक़दाम भी हैं और समाजी इक़दाम भी हैं. वेलकम बैक. हमारी गुफ्तगू जारी है पाकिस्तान में कौंसल सेक्शन के हेड जो हैं जॉन रियॉन से. वो हमें बता रहे हैं कि जबरी शादियां एक मसला है जिससे पाकिस्तानी जो हैं वो भी मुतासर हैं, और ख़ास तौर पर वो पाकिस्तानी जो कि बरतानिया में रहते हैं और बरतानवी शहरी हैं, उनका ये मामला काफ़ी पेचीदा है. इस पे बहुत से इक़दाम जो हैं वो किए जा रहे हैं. If a girl, for instance, is to be forcibly married, living in UK, can she protect?
Oh, she can. She absolutely can, and we would strongly recommend that she do. I should say that of all the forced marriage cases we have here in Pakistan, 4 in 5 are female, but 1 in 5 is male. Around 20% of the cases we have are male. So anybody, young or old, male or female, who feels they're being pressured into marriage, yes, should go straight to the police.
Right, and but there's a trend to usually to or it is known only after the marriage is done.
It's a key point, actually. Typically we will find out about a forced marriage not from the victim themselves, but from a friend of the victim. We must remember that forced marriages are something that are happening within the family, so it's very difficult for somebody to go to the police and talk about their own parents. Very often we find, as indeed was the case, the high-profile case in Birmingham that went through the courts, we find that a forced marriage victim is brought to Pakistan under false pretenses, and is then, then the events are set in chain to force that person into marriage. often the first person they will reach out to will not be the police or the High Commission. It'll be a friend or a trusted teacher or a social worker back in the UK. And from there, the message will get back to the High Commission, and that's where we can take action here in Pakistan.
What are the motives of these marriages? I mean, the economic, social, religious?
Well, every forced marriage is different, but when we're interviewing forced marriage victims, we do find some common themes that start to come out. The issue of family honor is something that comes out. Certainly the issue of economics. Very often the forced marriage is to a first cousin, and in so doing it keeps property within a tight family unit. So these are some of the themes that keep coming out in forced marriages.
But, I have noticed that some girls or some boys get married to for instance, a Pakistani young man would get married to a lady in UK, Pakistani origin, just to get a citizenship or legal status there.
Yes, indeed, and that is part of the problem is forced marriage for visa fraud, and indeed we've seen cases in the past where people with mental illness and people who've lacked capacity have been but had a British passport have been forced into marriage for effectively citizenship fraud.
So are you thinking or contemplating to make more stringent laws and the implementation is done in a very strict manner so that the people get a lesson or that they should not do it?
I'm certainly not aware of any impending law changes. Those would be for our Ministry of Justice and Home Ministry back in the UK to take forward. Here in Pakistan, we're dealing more with the symptoms. I think we're dealing more with the cases of forced marriage who've travelled to Pakistan, doing what we can to get those British nationals safe and out of their situation.
Right. Here in Pakistan, are you working with the local authorities, religious leaders and other social reformers, teachers, etc., to disseminate this information that that if they are going to do it, I mean, a forced marriage is done, then there'll be legal action against them?
Increasingly, yes, we are. We're doing more of that, and that's really been a step change for us. Back 3 or 4 years ago, our forced marriage work here in Pakistan was purely reactive. We would hear about a case, we would resolve that case. I'm putting a lot of my resources and my consular team now into prevention activities. So running campaigns here in country, talking to youth groups, talking to community groups, talking to religious scholars, talking to schools in areas with high concentrations of British nationals, and engaging with them on the illegal danger. That will take inevitably a little bit of time to start to affect the numbers, but as I say, we've had a 19% decrease globally in forced marriage and a 24% decrease here in Pakistan. So we're optimistic that those messages are starting to hit.
Yeah, it will. The young people living in UK with Pakistani origin, you think that they're also thinking in terms of discouraging this trend, or that this is still continuing?
It's hard to say. The numbers would suggest yes, that trend is going down. If we look at the breakdown of the numbers, as I say, we're seeing an increase, sadly, in minors, people under the age of 15, but we are seeing a more marked decrease in the sort of 15 to 35 age bracket. So I think going purely in the numbers, there is evidence there to suggest that the mindset is changing. I would caution, though, that we hear about no more than 10 to 15% of all the forced marriage cases involving British nationals. We expect that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of what is a forced marriage problem.
But the parents who were educated in UK and they lived for a long period of time, what is their thinking? I mean, have they been able to change their outlook towards forced marriages?
Certainly in some of the cases we've seen, this has been a real paradox. We've had Pakistanis who've traveled to the UK that become within a UK way of life, and then at some point in their parenthood, they decide that their children should go back to Pakistan and be married back in Pakistan. And it's an aspect of forced marriage that, speaking very frankly, I find quite hard to understand. But that's why we need to continually engage with the victims and try and understand better what these motivators for forced marriage are.
Right. But the young people who were born in UK from the Pakistani parents, what is their trend? I mean, how do they look at it?
I mean, I think increasingly, as young people all over the UK, not just in the Pakistan community, engage in social media and become increasingly integrated and so on and so forth, it becomes more difficult for things like forced marriage to be perpetrated. I have to say that the one custodial sentence that we've had, and the other conviction that we've had in regard to Bangladeshi origin family should send a helpful message out to the older generation within that community that if you force the next generation into marriage, it can land you in prison.
Right. But Pakistan is going now to UK. I mean, now there's a migration taking place. Do you think that they will be able to help you curb this tendency, or they will be a source of further increasing this trend?
I certainly hope it's the former. I certainly hope they will be able to aid us in the fight against forced marriage. I mean, forced marriage, let's be clear about forced marriage, it's a form of modern slavery. It's taking away, it's depriving somebody of their freedom, and it has no place in modern society, either here in Pakistan or indeed back in the UK. And I hope that anybody who wants to build a life for themselves in the UK will adopt those values and will understand that forced marriage is something we have to all fight against.
Since you have been observing this phenomena of forced marriages for a long period of time, what is your conclusion that some people compromise their human rights or their personal to make battlement?
I think that's inevitable, and but I don't think that's exclusive to the British Pakistani community in the UK. I think you can probably see examples of that in every community. However, I think with some of the women emancipation movement that's currently going on globally, not just in the UK, the Me Too movement and so on and so forth, increasingly people, particularly women, are asking the question, maybe this isn't my lot in life, maybe I don't have to enter into this marriage, for example, that I'm not comfortable with. Maybe there is something that can be done about it. And the more we get of that, the better, because my team is ready here in Pakistan to help any British Pakistani who finds himself in that situation.
So your observation about this whole phenomena of forced marriage, that how many young women or young men compromise their freedom just to be a part of the British society or to go there and to live there in order to build their economic fortunes?
Well, in terms of the forced marriage case numbers that we've seen, we tackled 77 forced marriage cases here in Pakistan in 2016, 59 cases here in Pakistan in 2017, with this 4-to-1 women to men split. Those are really the only numbers I have to go on. The number of people who enter into a marriage here in Pakistan, or indeed enter into a marriage back in the UK where there's been an element of coercion or an element of emotional blackmail and they don't feel comfortable with, it's hard for me to comment on that because we don't know the size of that particular problem. What I do know is, of all of those cases, 77 in 2016 and 59 last year, the victims themselves have all been incredibly brave in standing up and saying, no, you know what, I'm not happy, I need help with this. It takes an awful lot of courage to put your hand up and to ask for help in that situation. And I hope that others will take strength from that courage, from their action.
Do you think that those who these forces also contributes in some fashion?
We haven't seen any discernible pattern in terms of socioeconomic grouping, for example, as to as a motivator or a driver for forced marriage. We've seen forced marriages from British Pakistani families of very limited means, and indeed forced marriages, British Pakistani families,
rich people,
of very wealthy individuals indeed. So there doesn't seem to be any discernible pattern in terms of, certainly in terms of levels of wealth, and probably in terms of levels of education.
But education can make a difference. I mean, when you are enlightened, more educated, more progressive, then you start looking at life from a different perspective, from a different prism, and this economic benefits or money doesn't become so, it doesn't remain a very important, significant factor.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And that, I think, is why some of the outreach that my London colleagues are doing into schools in the UK, and this isn't just limited to British Pakistanis, they're going into schools all across the country, is so important to get some of those messages across.
Thank you. We'll take a short break and we'll continue this discussion. नाज़रीन, एक मुख्तसर ब्रेक लेते हैं. ब्रेक से वापसी के बाद हम पाकिस्तान में वीज़ा कौंसिल से गुफ्तगू जो है जारी रखेंगे. वो मैं बता रहे हैं कि क्या रुझानात हैं पाकिस्तानियों में जो कि बरतानिया में रहते हैं. फोर्स्ड मैरिजेज या जबरी शादियाँ किस तरह होती हैं और क्या समाजी मुहर्रकात हैं और क्या माशी मुहर्रकात हैं इन जबरी शादियों के. वेलकम बैक. हमारी बातचीत जारी है पाकिस्तान में वीज़ा सेक्शन के हेड से और वो बता रहे हैं जबरी शादियों के हवाले से. Another issue is the religious factor. I mean, there are religious schools in Pakistan, religious seminaries. Probably there would be some in UK as well, maybe, or some people under the influence of religious scholars there going to mosques and other areas where the religious influence can actually change their mind. So you think that this factor is also playing its role?
Well, firstly, if I may, I think you said I was from the visa section. I'm not. I'm from the consular section. The religious, the theological arguments against forced marriage are extremely important. And whilst, as I say, I'm not qualified to make those arguments, I'm not a Muslim or a religious scholar. We have engaged with a number of religious scholars, a number of peers. We've facilitated their travel to the UK so that they can go and make the theological arguments against forced marriage in mosques, and they've all been unequivocal that forced marriage has no place in Islam.
Right. But as you have observed this thing for quite a long period of time, the young Pakistanis who migrate to UK, people who are below 30 years of age, what is their trend? I mean, are they also susceptible to forced marriages, or they resist it?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the majority of the forced marriage victims that we help here in Pakistan are actually second-generation migrants. So their parents migrated to the UK, but the vast majority of them were born and bred in Britain. And it's actually one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of forced marriage, where you have, let's say, for the sake of argument, a 17, 18-year-old female who has been brought up in the UK, who has only really known life in the UK, who speaks fluent English as their native language rather than Urdu, and then is suddenly put into quite a traditional Pakistan situation, quite a restricted situation, and being forced into marriage, being denied freedom, and so on and so forth. And that's when all forced marriage cases are difficult, of course, but particularly difficult in those circumstances.
What role media can play in reversing this trend of forced marriages here in Pakistan and in UK?
I think exactly what we're doing now, discussing the issue and openly discussing the issue, openly discussing the problems around forced marriage, the illegality. If there's one aspect of forced marriage that I've seen in the 2.5 years I've been doing this job, it's that it tears families apart. The illegality aside, the theological arguments aside, the economic arguments aside, it tears families apart, and the families seldom recover from that. I think the role of the media is vitally important to highlight this issue, to highlight that there is a problem in many communities in the UK, including the British Pakistani community in the UK, and to have that open discussion about forced marriage. I think particularly to have that discussion around when an arranged marriage becomes a forced marriage, and what constitutes that level of coercion, because that's a very key point.
But do you frequently advertise or send a message to the Pakistani community living in UK through media or social media that this is a trend which needs to be discouraged, and this has legal implications, moral implications, social implications?
So I talk quite regularly to the Pakistan press here, and many of the media outlets that I speak to will also either air their programs or sell their newspapers back in some of the communities in the UK. And indeed there's other sort of outreach, if you like, we do here. We had a billboard campaign last year where we advertised our services in what we expected were specific choke points for British nationals who may be forced into marriage would be transiting. So there's quite a lot that we can do in terms of targeting the specific communities.
I've seen in UK some religious schools coming up there, and also religious scholars working there, going to UK, delivering lectures there. They have set up their own madrasa type institutions. So as well as the Pakistani community that this is something anti-Islamic, this is something against human rights, and it must be shunned.
In terms of engagement in the UK, that's not something we would run from here. Those would be my colleagues back in the UK. We have a joint unit back in the UK. It's a joint Foreign Office, my employer, and Home Office unit, the forced marriage unit, that focuses solely on forced marriage, and they act as both a call centre for people being forced into marriage or know of others being forced into marriage, and as the body that will run any outreach into the UK. I don't want to speak about their plans in the coming months too much, but as I understand it, they will be worth mentioning, though, that whilst there is an issue with forced marriage in the British Pakistan community, it's not exclusively the British Pakistan. Marriages in the British Indian community. Increasingly we have forced marriages in the British Somali community. So this is a countrywide problem that we're facing in the UK, and my colleagues back in Home Office, back in the UK in forced marriage unit, conduct quite wide-ranging outreach, and they go through every channel they think will have the maximum impact.
So what is your message for the Pakistani community here in Pakistan and those who have connections, social connections back in UK? What will be your message regarding the forced marriages?
Well, I think I'd have two messages really. The first message would be for any potential perpetrators of forced marriage. Anyone who's wanting to force a member of their family into a marriage that they don't accept. And that message is simply this: forced marriage destroys lives. It destroys families. We see it in every single case. Families never recover from this. It's not the right thing to do. Aside from the illegality of it, aside from the theological arguments, the economic arguments, it just destroys families. That's the first message I would like to give. The second message I would like to direct to either the victims of forced marriage or potential victims of forced marriage, or indeed to people who know of someone who's going to be a victim of forced marriage, British Pakistani. And it's simply this: get in touch with the British High Commission. There are a number of things we can do to help, and we will be tenacious, and we will not stop until we've got you out of your situation and we've got you safely back to the UK.
थैंक यू सो मच।
Very welcome.
नाज़रीन, आज इस प्रोग्राम में आपने पाकिस्तान में हमारे जो पाकिस्तान और अफ़गानिस्तान के लिए ब्रिटिश कौंसल हैं जॉन रियान, उनकी गुफ्तगू सुनी। मौजू था जबरी शादियाँ। हमें मालूम है कि पाकिस्तानी बड़ी तादाद में तकरीबन 12 से 15 लाख पाकिस्तानी बरतानिया के शहरी हैं और उन पर बरतानवी कवानीन का इतलाक़ होता है और वो बरतानी माशरे का हिस्सा है। लेकिन ये जबरी शादियों का एक सिलसिला है जो तवील अरसे से जारी है और बरतानवी हुकूमत कोशिश कर रही है कि ये जबरी शादियों का सिलसिला बंद किया जाए। जबरी शादियाँ इस्लाम में भी नाजायज़ हैं और दुनिया के तमाम समाज जो कि पढ़े लिखे, समझदार और जिनको अपने हुकूक का शऊर है, वो जबरी शादियों के ख़िलाफ़ हैं और इनकी भी कोशिश यही है कि जबरी शादियों का जो रुझान है इस पर काबू पाया जाए, चाहे उसके मुहर्रकात कुछ भी हों, माशी सहूलतों के लिए या माशी तहफ़्फ़ुज़ के लिए या किसी और वजह से या अपनी जायदादों को बचाने के लिए या अपनी इज़्ज़त और अपने आबरू के लिए अगर जबरी शादियाँ की जा रही हैं, हर सूरत में इनको रोका जाना चाहिए। इस पे आपने हमारे मेहमान की गुफ्तगू सुनी है। इसी के साथ ये प्रोग्राम ख़त्म होता है। जावेद सिद्दीक़ को इजाज़त दीजिए। खुदा हाफिज़। थैंक यू सो मच। इट्स प्लेजर टॉकिंग टू यू।
Thank you.
थैंक यू।